Okay. All right, everyone. This week we are talking about the business value of diversity and inclusion. Our speaker this week is Tanji Coleman. She's the Chief Possibility Officer at YWCA at Metropolitan Chicago. She is also the president of Reimagine Organization Development. It's a consulting firm that works with organizations to enhance their business performance. Tanji, thank you so much for being with us today. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it's a little varied. So I started out as a flight attendant in the aviation industry and morphed into human resources, where I've really grown my career from being on the talent acquisition side to generalist, and now on the executive leadership side, mainly focusing on organization development, engagement, D&I, and employee relations.
Awesome. Now let's get right into it. Diversity and inclusion. What is the business value? If a D&I leader is watching this conversation, how should they structure their business case?
Absolutely. So I kind of want to take us a little step back to some things that have happened recently that we've heard about in the news, and how that really impacts brands, how it impacts customer loyalty, and et cetera. So for those that might not follow the general news as closely, recently we heard of issues with Gucci and the blackface sweaters that they created that were over $800. Mm-hmm. We heard of Katy Perry and her blackface shoes, Prada with the blackface figurines. Wow. And then you had H&M with actually a monkey hoodie worn by a young African-American boy. And then we had Kendall Jenner, who was seemingly handing a can of Pepsi to a police officer in the midst of individuals being very concerned about police brutality in their neighborhoods.
Yep.
And so what do all of these different gaffes and mistakes and missteps really mean for these brands? It means that they've lost millions, they've suffered brand damage, and they've lost customer loyalty, because there has been a lot of activists now out saying, I will never buy Gucci brand again. I will not support Prada. So these organizations, these companies have lost customers that were very loyal, and that translates into money, and that translates then into shareholder concern, because now it's not only just a brand and marketing issue, it's actually a finance issue. And so when I hear about the business case for diversity, or when these missteps happen, people typically go to a very simplified solution. And that is, well, there aren't enough people of color in the room, or there aren't any people of color or diversity in the room. And so where I beg to differ kind of with this oversimplification is for a few reasons. What this really means is that we can't trust the people that are in the room to make the right decisions, regardless of what their ethnicity is. Yeah. So you have to have known that a sweater representing blackface would be offensive to not only people of color, but to a lot of other individuals as well. So to me, if you're selling products, if you are engaging with consumers, it is your duty and responsibility to not harbor ignorance, to learn history, to display basic human decency, and to really have a good temperature check on what's happening out in various communities outside of your own. So to say that it's just about not having individuals of diversity or people of color at the table is really giving everyone else at the table a pass. And so what that means is, when you have an entire leadership team, and typically on these executive leadership teams, there might maybe be one person of color. This one person of color, a diverse person, has to stand up and rise up against everyone else at the table, inform, educate, and redirect. Is this one person's responsibility, is really looking at the whole situation from my perspective, from a very narrow focus. And we are not allowing people to have accountability where they should. So it's, in addition to that, it's really about giving people at all levels a voice. So you can't tell me that people in the design area, the merchandising area, the packaging area, the marketing department, and other parts of the organization at various levels, that no one in these areas tried to stop the train on this or said it was inappropriate. They probably did, but their voices weren't heard because they were not at the right hierarchical level, or they were ignored, or they didn't say anything because they felt like there would be some repercussions or retaliation for even bringing it to the table. So there, in my opinion, is a lot of opportunity, not just for people sitting at the leadership table, but throughout an organization where everyone's voice can be heard, everyone feels that their opinion is taken seriously,
Yeah.
and that there's conversation that you can have.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that when these events happen, organizations tend to think of it as a simple solution.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we need additional training. Yeah, but it's much more than that. I love your perspective. It's really about thinking about D&I as a competency and integrating it within the systems and processes throughout the organization, so
Mm-hmm.
that it becomes a way of thinking, so that these types of incidences they don't happen, or they happen a lot less, because
Exactly.
you have the checks and balances. I really really love that. So what's your perspective? How can an organization make D&I more of an organizational competency, where you have people outside of HR thinking about how important this is?
Yeah, so I think that organizations who are forward thinking, it's not just about the D&I perspective, but it's also just about the evolution of their culture and what that looks like. And do people feel that they have the latitude to share their voice and opinion? Because it starts there. Um, when individuals see that leadership might be going in a direction that they're scratching their heads about, or they feel that some things are being said that are inappropriate, or practices are being put into place, or policies being put into place that might offend or hold back a certain group.
Yeah.
It takes that person to stand up, but that person feeling that they have the freedom to stand up, they have to know that there's no retaliation. They have to know that their voices are going to be heard, and they have to know that leadership wants to hear from them and welcome their opinion. So although most of the time diversity and inclusion lives within HR, there are ways to ensure that all functional areas have accountability for the success of cultural transformation efforts and D&I efforts, because you can't have one without the other. You can't really have successful, succinct, integrated, innovative D&I efforts without addressing your culture. You have to do both in tandem. And so one of the ways is to have, once again, D&I baked into the culture, but also accounted for in performance measures. And so when there is clear accountability, people will rise to the occasion, because it becomes ingrained in the culture, and it becomes part of what individuals are expected to do. So leading companies are doing some great things in the D&I space. One is really measuring engagement. Like, how engaged are your team members? And you can track engagement to help you understand what's happening culturally, but also help you understand what's happening in the D&I world.
So
Also,
can I jump in real quick, because
sure.
I love this, right? Because a lot of companies are over assessing their engagement. Are you saying that it would make sense to have a diversity and an inclusion question included in the engagement survey, so that they can almost assess engagement from those two lenses? Because, and I've been corrected on this before, that sometimes when we bucket D&I, it's really two separate things. They have two separate meanings. What are your thoughts on that? Should companies take the time to kind of enter two separate areas or two separate questions, so that they can really dive deep to understand if they're making progress with D&I?
Well, one of the things I think that I look to do in working with clients, and even working within the YWCA, is not to convolute things to make it too cumbersome for people, because then that gives everyone an off ramp, right? This is too difficult. It's going to be too hard. If you feel that you're not being represented, or D&I efforts aren't scaling in the way that they should, there's no way engagement is going to be where it should be. Now, I do understand what you mean in terms of over analyzing engagement, and maybe putting your foot on the scale a little bit. With engagement, there's a few things. You have to ensure that the information you're getting is pure. Yeah. And when I say that, you can't, I don't think having certain rewards around completing engagement surveys, or having necessarily certain scores really leads itself to good practices, because then people start to feel like, hey, if my compensation is going to be adjusted by this, right? If it's going to be somehow compromised based on these engagement scores, you start to see bad behaviors begin and manifest themselves. Yeah. So engagement should be something that's organic. It should allow folks anonymity, and people should feel like they want to participate or they don't want to participate. So, but once you engage in the process, you can get a lot of information from it. And depending on what engagement organization you use, you might get more or less of that information. So I'll give you a great example. Here at the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago, we're working with an organization that's called Holistic. And the reason they're called Holistic is they look at the whole employee. And part of that, one of the cool things that they sat down and did with us that really falls in the D&I space, is looking at multi-level and diversity compensation modeling. So if you have a leadership team, what is the ratio of their compensation compared to the directors, the managers, the vice presidents, the other individuals? So we can look at it from level, but then we can go back and look at it and scale it from ethnicity and also from age. And then if we see a gap, we can dig further. So we can see if there's an education gap. So if we're seeing large gaps in compensation, perhaps folks are being compensated more because they have maybe a master's degree or PhD or certification, and it's not just ethnicity or level. So being able to have that lens to make sure that you're being fair and equitable at all levels is very, very important, because that falls a lot into not only diversity and inclusion, but as we've been hearing a lot about pay equity, right? Making sure that our pay equity is reasonable and that the ratio of senior leaders and everyone else is what would be a reasonable or average standard, and not this huge deviation. So that's one way of looking at it. And then also retention. And I've seen so many organizations really measure how many diverse individuals they bring into an organization, but they don't really pay attention to the retention piece. And so you're bringing in a lot of people, but a lot of people are leaving out the door, and you're bringing in more people, so you always look good, but you're not really looking at the reputation and the team member employee experience that they've had as they leave the organization. Absolutely. So another way that you can look at retention is, run what your average tenure is. And if you see that certain groups are leaving before that average tenure, then it's time to dig in and have some interviews to figure out what it is that's happening and what you can do as an organization, as a leadership team, as a leader, to ensure that people feel safe, feel that they're getting the career development that they need, whatever it is that the engagement survey is telling you and your team members and employees are telling you they need to stay within your organization. But also a good practice is to really have stay interviews. I'm a huge proponent of stay interviews.
Oh, stay interviews. Not just interviewing when they're on their way out.
Exactly. So what I noticed is there's a lot of fanfare when people leave organizations. There's a big party, there's a cake, people take you out for cocktails and drinks, and you have this nice sit down with someone from HR or whoever's over the exit interview process. And you get to tell at that time everything that was bothersome to you as to the reason you left. And one or two things happen with that information. Oftentimes, it's put in a drawer someplace, or it becomes a gripe session for the person that's leaving. But instead, why not catch those folks before they leave? So you look at your team members that are with you less than 90 days, a year, and at different touch points, and you have a conversation with them about what is it that they're enjoying, where could there be some changes, where do they see themselves going in the organization, and have those conversations so you can impact those changes and implement some of the feedback that you're getting so you retain your good team members that you want to retain versus you're finding out a slew of information on the back end that you had no idea about, and you can't change this person's mind now. They've already resigned. They're mentally disconnected from your organization. And in addition to that, there's this big celebration. So I did have a team member say to me once, wow, we don't throw parties for the people that are staying here. Why are we throwing this humongous shindig for someone that's leaving the organization? Of course, we wish everyone well that wants to grow their career and do different things, but we also need to spend as much time with the individuals that are with the organization and making sure that we keep them engaged and communicate to them, overly communicate to them how much they're valued and how much we want them within our team.
Yeah, yeah. I as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, in your experience, how are companies funneling up, major themes or concerns around diversity or inclusion? I know some organizations have BRG groups, the business resource groups. But in my experience, the groups are kind of doing their own thing, and not oftentimes are they really coming together to really get a strong picture on whether they're making progress across the organization. But what are your thoughts? What are some tactics that you see companies using?
Exactly. And honestly, BRG groups, I've always looked at as more as mentoring arms and groups where you can get information from about how to grow your career, how to address certain issues. They're not really the repository for seeing particular problems and having the ability to solve them, because individuals in those groups are at different levels. They might not be at leadership levels. Usually still, there's a leadership person overseeing the group, but most of the participants might be middle management.
Yeah.
Also, where I don't see a lot of collaboration is, to your point, amongst all those BRG groups, right? So you might have moms at work, you might have the Hispanic group, you might have a millennial organization, but they all, to your point, separate, they all operate very separately.
Yeah.
And so bringing those groups together, maybe annually or twice a year, to share themes might be a good idea. But in terms of core D&I objectives and how they roll up, in my opinion, they should roll up and be part of the CEO's scorecard and strategic plan. In all organizations, they are not. So that's one area where I would say, if you're really serious about D&I, your CEO should be very in tune to what's happening, be kept abreast to what's going on, and that D&I leader or executive should be at the table with the CEO and his other direct reports. Because if you're not there, more than likely the messaging is not going to get to the place where you need it to be. Therefore, you're not going to see the traction and outcomes that you desire in those roles. And so, another piece is we talk about diversity and inclusion roles, and what they mean is we're seeing a lot of individuals being put into the role, but some of the anecdotal feedback that I'm getting is about there is kind of a leader over it, right? So you have what people are referring to maybe as a D&I figurehead.
Yeah.
But there isn't adequate budget. You might not have direct reports. You might not have your HRS system set up properly to track data so you can really give good data analysis when you're at the table. There's not real talent acquisition strategies designed to attract individuals to your organization. There's misalignment, the strategic vision isn't there, accountability is off. And so when you have those things, regardless of how great a D&I leader is that you bring into the organization, when they're faced with those barriers, it's hard for them, extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to truly be successful and move the needle where they need to move the needle.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a few more minutes left. I really want you to talk about this movement that companies and investors are doing right now. Social investing. Tell us more about that.
Right. So we're hearing a lot about D&I and a lot about people wanting to see more traction and more movement. And so where organizations and where individuals are really putting their money where their mouth is with this whole socially responsible investing, or impact shares is called. And this is really the creation of social impact through investing. So if you want to see organizations that have more women as board members, that have more women as CEOs, then you invest in companies that are proving that they have plans in place and they are actively engaged in moving that needle. So as far as the impact shares, there's 4 key areas. One is gender balance in leadership and the workforce. The second is equal compensation and workplace balance. The third is policies promoting gender equality. And the fourth is commitment, transparency, and accountability. And under each 4 of those pillars, you have several bullet points that can be tracked and measured. And so the companies that are part of this index have made a commitment to actively engage in those 4 pillars with those bullets. So our CEO, Dory McWhorter, the genesis of the Woman ETF, which is WOMN ETF, was created here at the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago under the leadership and support of our CEO, Dory McWhorter. And I do want to read a direct quote from her about this.
Absolutely.
And she says, and I want to be exact, so we believe that the criteria used to evaluate the companies in the index provides a roadmap for corporate America for the empowerment of the women in their workforces and will ultimately result in increased value creation for shareholders. So it's not just about a nicety, it's really about creating shareholder value by having diversity, by having diverse of thought and leadership, and having organizations committed to that. But I do want to be clear that the YWCA is not an investment advisor or promoter of the Woman Fund. I am making individuals aware. If you are interested in learning more, you can visit our webpage at ywcachicago.org, or you can go to www.impactetfs.org to learn more about the fund itself. But the thought is, why would you continue to invest in organizations that aren't investing in you? Why would you continue to spend your money in organizations that aren't promoting women to leadership positions, aren't promoting women on their board of directors, and having them be real leaders within the organization where you're spending, part of your hard-earned cash? So now people can have more of an impact through their investing and through their money, not just saying, I'm not going to shop at that store, but also I'm not going to shop there, but I'm not going to invest because I feel like this company over here is more vested in my success, the success of, and many people now have sons and daughters in the workforce that are going to make sure that they're reaching their career goals and the pinnacles of success that they want to reach. So it really is a movement around walking the walk, right? You're going to take your funds and invest them where people are investing in you, in your career.
Yeah, no, I think that's like really, really cool information. I really believe that the workforce is going to look different. I think it's going to look different in the next 5-7 years. A lot of what you're talking about with D&I often hear from other speakers in areas of learning, in areas of change management. And I think it goes back to, if you think about like the late 70s and 80s, when executives were getting their MBA, I don't think there was a program for D&I at that particular time, right? So like these are almost developmental skills and competencies that they now have to catch up with. And so I think that's part of the rub. But the next generation of executives, the next generation of leadership over the next 5 to 7 years, they would have, they would have a lot more information about D&I,
Mhm.
in certification programs, like all throughout their schools. I mean, there's degree programs on D&I now.
Mhm.
So I think the workforce is going to be tremendously different in the next 5.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to give one additional little factoid about connecting the dots here. So there is a direct correlation between women who are on boards as in board of director ranks
Yep.
and the increase in female CEOs. So board of women on the boards have increased to 25%. We've also seen the women CEOs increase from 24 last year to 33 this year. So we're seeing that insulating leadership with board members that are female is having a direct impact on how many women are being voted into CEO positions at major Fortune 500 organizations. And so, where there is still a gap and an opportunity is for women of color. So, we still, since Ursula Banks, have had this gap for over 2 years without any African American woman or woman of color leading a Fortune 500 organization. Um, if we go down to Fortune 1000, we have one, Lisa Waddell, who's over Adeline and DeVry. But we have an interim CEO, Mary Winston at Bed Bath & Beyond. She's an interim CEO, so she hasn't really been given the position full time. So that says a lot because there's this correlation between board members and CEOs, but a lot of those board members aren't people of color still.
Mm-hmm.
We also have now this conundrum of African American women being the most educated sector in the country, yet it's not manifesting to leadership or senior leadership roles in the way that one would think. And so part of my next generation of research that I'm working on is women leadership, and why aren't we seeing more women of color scaling in that area? And also the D&I space, when we have a lot of D&I chiefs and VPs, why we aren't seeing necessarily the movement in the D&I space and attraction that one would think. So those are my next two areas of research that I'll be working on, speaking on over the next several months.
Yeah, awesome. So for someone watching this video, what's the one thing you want them to take away from it?
I really want them to take away that we all have a responsibility towards D&I efforts, outcomes, and results. It's not the one person of color sitting at the table to feel like they have to have the weight on their shoulders and explain everything to everyone else. We all have a responsibility to understand history, digest it. Sometimes it's painful. It's not easy to see. We know a lot of folks watching it didn't personally engage in it, but there is a byproduct of it, right? And it's still a systemic issue. And so you have to take a deep breath and go in and understand where people are coming from, understand different perspectives and values. And that was really the genesis of me writing my diversity journal, is because right now we're becoming more and more polarized. People are in the right-hand corner, the left-hand corner. People aren't coming towards the middle and negotiate anymore and really understand and respect different viewpoints. And so part of that journal was meant to take you on different assignments where you have to interact with individuals that are different than you, spiritually, religiously, educationally, through a lot of different, about 25 different areas where you can appreciate different viewpoints. You can appreciate and understand maybe why someone didn't go to college and you did. You can appreciate and understand why someone went to the military and you didn't serve. And just have a genuine conversation with people that are different from you. We hear a lot about small town USA versus the big cities and rural areas versus metropolitan areas. Understanding those differences and understanding the value system. I believe we're more alike than different. We all want the best for our communities, our children, our nieces, our nephews, and our families. And that's no different if you're in LA or if you're in a small town. And so how do we bridge that gap? And that was really the genesis of that journal, because I do have a lot of friends that live in small towns that don't appreciate metropolitan areas. And so understanding their viewpoint was really important to me, and I took the time to do so.
Yeah, this is interesting because I feel like we're about to talk for another 30 minutes. There's so many.
Right.
It's interesting. You grow up, right, as a child, and you go to school, and you're with your family, and you learn certain values. But what you just said is not often taught at a young age. My older son is 11 years old, and I was telling him, I said, what contributed to my growth throughout my entire life is really taking the time to understand other people who come from different backgrounds than me, because it just helps you. It just helps you. Period. Right. And then truth be told, the people who have offered me the most opportunities came from different backgrounds from me, right? And so it's the beauty of networking, the beauty of getting the opportunity to learn about other people from other backgrounds, other races. It's been tremendous ROI for me personally. And we're not even talking about the workforce. We're just talking about in life.
In general, right. And that's also, some of, there's also this other movement now talking about education, and education is expensive, and now you don't necessarily need it. What I've always looked at education as, it's not about the piece of paper. That's why I don't necessarily run around having people, you have to call me doctor. It's not really about that. What it was more about for me is just being around, to your point, different individuals, getting a broader, bigger global view of the world. And part of that experience you get is when you interact and have the opportunity to engage with individuals that are different than you, because sometimes outside of education, it doesn't happen. You work where you live, you go to school where you live, and then you're insulated with the same kind of thought process that you might have. And until you break out and travel or go someplace different or join the Peace Corps, join the military, you don't really get that experience. So it's best to, and now for individuals who are kind of in the left corner, right corner, we have to superficially have adults go through this process so that they are stretching themselves and getting to know people that are different.
Yeah, before we go, and we didn't prep for this, so if this goes sideways, I'll edit it out the video. What are your thoughts on organizations and really around brands taking a stand on certain issues? So right, because our community within the U.S. is kind of polarized sometimes, and brands will have to stand for something. I was reading an article. I think it was out of SHRM. It was talking about an HR role in like 2025, and it was like I think it was called like a culture architect. And then my wife is earning her PhD in this in community psychology. And in the same article, they talked about a culture architect. They also talked about a community psychologist, working, on the HR leadership team, helping brands navigate different, mindsets and patterns in the communities they serve, in the community of their customer. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ran across that type of research or article?
Absolutely. And companies are taking a stand. I think some of them are, trying to do it organically in-house. So we've seen not only companies, but educational institutions as well have these focus groups around things that have caused people trauma, and trying to, or a focus group around when have you been discriminated against? What did it feel like? And having these focus groups around that. My only caution with that is you have to have a facilitator that is trained in having those conversations, and keep them at a level where it's digestible for folks, and it's going to keep the conversation moving forward, versus going in a completely different direction. So companies are trying to adhere to what their employees are experiencing, as well as their customer base. So, if you are a large organization, or even any size organization, and you're in a community where there has been police brutality, or there is random crime happening, you have to address it. You have to address it from a safety perspective. You have to address it from a community perspective, but then you also have to put resources behind it to try to alleviate the problem and try to make it more palatable for all individuals. When employees come into work and being in human resources, when they walk in that door, they're walking in with all of their sorrows, their fears, their disappointments, their physical ailments, their challenges at home, as well as the good stuff.
Yep.
And so your leader, manager, organization, HR team has to take all of those things into consideration. Organizations are now also becoming more trauma informed around these things, and having conversation around them. But I do agree with the position of having someone that's much more astute in psychology and community and cultural psychology to facilitate some of these conversations, because I do know companies think they're doing a great thing trying to have these conversations organically, but sometimes understanding cultural humility can be very challenging. It's one of the things we do through our workplace solutions here is work with organizations on cultural humility. What does it mean? What have your experiences been? What has it been like for you to have privilege when you didn't even realize it was a privilege? When you look at everyone behind you who didn't have that same opportunity, then you start to understand how you benefited from it, but then how you can also rectify, give back, and be a more active, engaged community member.
Awesome. So Tanji, hold on one second. I'm going to try to transition Eric into the conversation. He just pinged me and said he had a question. Eric, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I was trying to move to a little less noisy area, just sitting in the public area. Great discussion, by the way. I love the questions, Tanjo. I love what you talked about, especially these stay interviews. That's a pretty, I've never heard that term before, but that makes also a lot of sense. And I actually recently left my corporate job. I'm actually going back to grad school to kind of study like learning organizational change, including things like D&I. And I was literally seeing the same things about like what I've kind of seen at my last company and I work for a very, very large, I won't name which one, but a very large beer company. And I was very involved in like the ERGs as well as D&I initiatives not as an HR person, but as someone in the business, and kind of curious to get your take. So I always think about, I totally agree about like accountability, but I always kind of wonder I think a lot of organizations figure out of like how to actually hold them accountable. So who should really own getting this into an organization's like, accountability. So whether you talk about like metrics, like we always had listening sessions like as leaders in the company with the CEO, but it seems like we always had this very, very vast difference in what upper management was saying, what kind of the lower level middle management. We sort of had this very disparate view of kind of like where like the directors and senior directors at. So kind of we always had a trouble with like it was great at the top, great at the bottom, but we got very little connectivity and D&I in the middle. And that was a known issue, but we could never figure out how to actually implement it more.
Right. So, yeah, I think first of all, one of the reasons why I talked about visioning and strategic planning is once you have your visioning session and you agree upon the strategic plan that's in place, so you know the outcomes that you desire to have, then all levels have to make sure that they're backing into what those outcomes are. It's no different than, in large organizations, how you have the roll up and roll down of performance expectations,
exactly.
Right? You couldn't write your performance expectations until you had your chiefs or your VPs, and then it kind of scale from there. It's no different. It can be the same absolute process. What I don't want to happen is people feel like it's too complicated, too convoluted, so they don't do anything. If you follow some of the processes that are already in place for organizations, you just can add D&I in there, but you have to make sure that everyone is in agreement with what you're measuring and why you're measuring it. Exactly. And then you have the activities that map to whatever that strategic plan is that came from your visioning session. So whether it's enhancing retention, whether it's providing mentoring and role modeling for within your organization for individuals. If it's how you conduct your succession planning efforts, what's said in there, and how do you then sponsor the folks that are ready for their next move? Is it executive MBA program? Is it continuous learning? Is it on the job learning? Are you following kind of this 70-20-10 model to make sure that you're helping people continue to develop? And also, there is this, and I was at recently at an event, and two events. And one was very different than the other to me, and I'll explain why. One was very risk averse in terms of telling individuals you're not allowed to really make mistakes. They're not digestible. That came from the diversity event that I went to. And then the other event that wasn't as diverse really talked about having the latitude to try new things, to take risks. And if you fail, it's okay. You pick yourself up, you kind of get back on the pony and you ride off into the sunset. But there is this expectation in organizations, particularly amongst people of color, that failure is not an option. And so when you feel failure is not an option, it can stifle your creativity. It can stifle your input and how you engage, because you feel there's no room for mistakes. And in often cases, that's a very valid feeling. So it's just a different dichotomy. And how do we break that down? How do we allow people to try new things? And if it doesn't work out, great, but at least you can say you've done it and you've taken some good tidbits and learning lessons from that experience. But back to your original question of accountability. Accountability is everyone's responsibility at every level, but you have to agree upon what you're measuring. To me, that's the most important piece of the entire pie.
Awesome.
That makes sense.
Eric, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, no, that is perfect. And I was actually thinking that the more I kind of think about it, I actually even feel some of the processes that are accompanied for what we do on other ones, like whether your operating plan or targets, were also not quite as clear as we thought. So that's also probably some of the reason why even the cascading back down and cascading back up, why people really couldn't see the goals. And I'm beginning to kind of see more after I left the company that those are issues we actually had on the other things, not even just D&I. But definitely the one, Tanji, I think the one, I really like the fact that you actually touched on kind of that earlier when you're talking about just the issues with all the different products and everything, that didn't feel like was there some type of area where folks could have just stopped it. And I've been reading a lot, and maybe you've seen a lot, they always talk about the idea of like psychological safety. So in companies now, because that's the idea, is like, you hear a lot of companies say, oh, we are an open company, we evaluated the comments and advice ever. And when really how they operate, I think this is very hierarchical. So decisions are made from top down, and you will be spoken to, or you will be able to speak given your experience or whatever. So it's kind of interesting that just as a comment, not necessarily like asking a question, but like I've kind of seen this with some other companies that we talked about, just as like the ability to speak up. Is kind of like the idea of psychological safety. So thinking like from like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, if you expect someone to do more than just kind of their job, they need to be able to feel safe in that one to advance different knowledge and not be potentially punished for that. Like they can make mistakes, but learn from them.
Right. And a lot of organizations that have the bandwidth and scale and might not have necessarily the fluidity because they are a large organization, they do have ethics lines and things of that nature where you can report things. But once again, you can report it, but how is the information synthesized? How is it analyzed? Is there any action that really takes place from it? That's another that's another conundrum, right? But I do know a lot of organizations do have ethics lines where if you see certain things that you feel are awry or not aligning with your principles, your values, what is the culture that the organization is trying to set, that someone's deviating from that. There are those outlets that you can utilize, but once again, how are they followed up on? And then also how are those folks being addressed and kind of redirected to go in the right direction, either with the organization or not with the organization.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Gosh, man, we could talk for another hour on this. I'm telling you. But Tanji, listen, I promised you no more than an hour. So I want to be mindful of your time. Eric, thank you for the engagement. Thank you for the questions. I thought they were great. Tanji, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a great conversation, needs to be had, and there's a lot of champions out there trying to do the right thing, and we all need support in getting there.
Awesome. All right, this concludes the webcast.